311 miles on the clock. That's just very slightly over 500 kilometres. And that of course means that the Interceptor is ready for its first service. So far it's been that classic man gets to know machine experience. And in that 300 miles, the suspension has slackened off substantially. It was a little bit stiff to start with, but there was a noticeable difference in rider comfort from about 200 miles. There was an initial rawness to the engine, which to be fair wasn't bad, but this has now gone away. It's become much more refined, much smoother, as the engine's loosened up and the components inside have learned to live together. The gearbox has been a little bit glitchy, the first 100 miles being the worst, a common occurrence of false neutrals, with the occasional tantrum of downright obstinance where gears refuse to engage at all. But again, from about 150 miles onwards, this subsided considerably and is now a much rarer occurrence, something that should improve with time. Now, I said from the start that I was going to do a first service video, which really is very similar to a 6,000 mile service. So what I've decided to do, instead of blasting through the entire procedure in one big video, I'm going to break it up into smaller, digestible chunks. We all have different abilities and different comfort levels, and although there are some aspects of a service that we might be quite okay with carrying out, there might be one or two things like tappet adjustment that is a bit out of our comfort zone and we would rather leave to the professionals. So I'm planning, I think off the top of my head at the moment, 4 videos. This first one covering the oil change, another one covering the tappet adjustment and spark plug gaps, a video covering chain adjustment and lubrication, cleaning, that kind of thing, and then a final video covering all the other things that are mentioned in the service book. These are all things that need to be carried out on the first service. They are all also covered in the 6,000 mile service. So hopefully it will be a record or reference that people can go back to, a video covering each of the relevant topics. Now, apart from tools, there are of course some materials that you're going to need to carry an oil change out. Some sort of drip tray or drip pan to catch the old oil when you drop it out of the bike. Either a 1 litre or 2 litre clear plastic jug, a funnel, your motor oil, and of course an oil filter. Now, some people like to take the bike out for a 4 or 5 mile ride before they drop the oil to warm it through and get all those contaminants that may be in the oil up in suspension rather than sitting on the bottom of the sump. The idea being that this will give you a much cleaner oil change. This is also a method that I advocate myself, but I do advise caution. Obviously, if you go for a 5 mile run, that oil is going to be very hot when you've completed the journey, and there is a danger of you burning your hands while you're dropping the oil out. So if you do decide to go down that route, please leave the bike to stand for about 25 minutes, half an hour before going through this procedure. What I prefer to do if I can is just start the engine up and let it run for 3 or 4 minutes just to warm the oil up, get all the contaminants up into suspension. I then let it stand for just 10 minutes after switch off, and it's usually okay to drop the oil without any danger of burning yourself. Now, as it stands, oil filters, there is only the OEM Royal Enfield oil filter available at this time, and I have to say they are a bit silly expensive at £20 a go. Now, I've been aware that there has been a bit of a shortage of these filters, with some people complaining that their dealership has had to delay their service by as much as 3 or 4 weeks while they're waiting for supplies of the filters to actually come through. Now, I would imagine there'll be a plentiful supply for you guys in India. If you live anywhere in the European Union and you are struggling to get hold of one, Manhattan Motorcycles in Sheffield do usually have a good stock of them, and they will post throughout Europe. I'll leave a link in the video description down below to their website if you're struggling to get hold of one. Right, first things first, before we get onto the subject of oil, get your drip tray in place underneath the bike and place it in a manner that ensures that as the oil comes out, it does actually catch it and it doesn't overshoot the tray. Then remove your oil filler cap. This allows the free passage of air into the engine as the old engine oil has been drained out. So in effect, it'll allow the oil to drain faster. The reason for this is that as that oil comes out, you want it to sweep out as many contaminants as possible. Then remove your sump drain plug. Now, I found my sump drain plug to be quite stiff. It was quite a tight thread, and I think the reason for this is that at the factory they've used some sort of sealant on the threads. Be careful not to drop it into the container with the old oil in it, because as we all know, retrieving it from there is a nasty job. Put your sump plug somewhere safe for cleaning, and then allow the oil to drain for at least half an hour, or even an hour if you've got the spare time. Now, engine oil, this always seems to be a contentious subject. Almost all modern engines now require a fully synthetic oil. Emissions regulations mean that engines operate at much higher temperatures than they ever had before. And in a lot of cases, a mineral-based oil just isn't up to the job. And the best synthetic oils you can possibly use are ester-based synthetic oils. There are other types available, and yes, those oils generally do tend to be a little bit cheaper, but they don't quite have the same lubricating qualities that ester does. Now, I believe Silkolene were the first to produce a fully synthetic motor oil, quite literally decades before anyone else. And I remember back in the early 1980s, Silkolene oils were viewed with some suspicion because it just didn't seem right putting something in your engine to lubricate it that hadn't come out of the ground. I started using it in the late 1980s, and I've used it ever since. Now, it was another 20 something years before synthetic oils became mainstream and other companies started producing synthetic oils, and it doesn't take a genius to work out that Silkolene were quite literally decades ahead of those other companies in the development of this kind of product. So I've stuck with them, and I've never once had cause to regret it. Now, if you remember, what is it, a year and a half ago, I did my first oil change on the Triumph T120. Now, on its first service, the dealership had put some no-name synthetic oil in that I'd never heard of. And I think they charged me about £50 for it, so I wasn't just going to waste it and drop it straight out. At that time, the Triumph did burn a noticeable amount of oil. It wasn't a lot, but it was noticeable. And I'd been getting an average of about 65 miles to the gallon. When I swapped over to this Silkolene Pro 4, which in the Triumph is the 10W40 version, the fuel consumption instantly came down. I'd been getting about 65 miles to the gallon. It now reliably returns 70 to 72 miles to the gallon. And that is quite a difference. Now, this apparently is down to Silkolene's XP technology. I'm not entirely sure what that is, which does boast fuel savings, so I can vouch for that. It does do that. It also boasts an 18% lower oil consumption. Now, I can't quantify a percentage, but what I will say is that the Triumph T120 hasn't burned any oil since I switched over to the Silkolene Pro 4. The oil level is exactly where it was when I filled it up. Now, to my mind, if the bike is burning significantly less fuel than it used to, that must mean that there's less friction on the moving parts in the engine. And if there's less friction on the moving parts in the engine, there's going to be less wear. So my opinion, and this is just my opinion, there's no finer motorcycle engine oil on the market. Now, a few of you guys from India have contacted me saying that you can't locate Silkolene in your country. I did send Silkolene an email. They tell me that Silkolene is actually available in India through the Fuchs network, Fuchs being the parent company of Silkolene. It's just that thus far there hasn't been a huge demand for Silkolene in India. Now, Silkolene have left me a link which I'll leave in the video description down below, and if anyone in India is interested in procuring some for their Interceptor or any other bike for that matter, drop them an email on that email link, and they've told me that they will do their best to sort you out. Now, as you'll have seen while I've been waffling away about Silkolene, I dispensed 2 litres of Silkolene's Rasberry goodness into a 2 litre plastic jug, ready to go into the engine. But before we do that, there are 1 or 2 other little things that we need to attend to. First of all, we need to remove the old oil filter. During the early stages of the running in process, tiny particles of metal will have been dislodged from various components in the engine, and the existing oil filter will have caught a lot of those, which has effectively started to clog it up, so it needs to be removed. I've got various tools for removing oil filters. It's very accessible on the Interceptor, so I used my oil filter removal pliers. I have to say, this filter was on extremely tight. It's probably a product liability thing on Royal Enfield's part, but I really don't think there's any need to fasten an oil filter up as tight as that. Once you've got it removed, place it open side down into your oil collector and allow it to drain, then dispose of it safely. Now, to assist with proper seating of the new oil filter, first of all, with something like a clean workshop wipe, thoroughly wipe down and clean up all the mating surfaces where the new filter is going to go on. Also, clear away any drips that may have dribbled down the engine block while there was oil still coming out of the filter opening. I've spent many a long hour trying to sort out a leak on an oil filter, and actually sump plugs for that matter, thinking that they were leaking when in actual fact it was just residual oil from the oil change that I hadn't cleaned up properly, and it was dribbling down in such a way that it led me to believe that it was oil coming from where the filter was connected. Save yourself a lot of hassle. Make sure that there is no oil residue anywhere on the engine before you start refilling it. Once that's done, taking a little bit of engine oil, just a dab on the end of your finger, just spread it along the rubber seal on the opening of the oil filter. Also, press that seal down firmly. These oil filters aren't the best quality I've ever seen, and the seal literally just sits there, it's not crimped in place. So push it down firmly all the way around its circumference to make sure that it is seated into the filter as far as it will go. Now, the oil on the seal is just there to lubricate the actual filter as you tighten it on. It just assists in getting a reliable seal first time without over tightening. When you've done that, screw the filter on, and I always do this by hand. Screw it on until the two surfaces meet and it starts to offer some resistance. Then turn it a 1/2 to 3/4 of a turn by hand. That will be enough to seal it. It should also ensure that you're not wrestling to get it off next time you do an oil filter change. There is a specific torque setting for these oil filters. It's not a lot, and using this method I have never ever had a leak. Before you replace your sump plug, it needs to be cleaned. On the end that protrudes into the sump, there's a magnet, and this magnet is designed to catch any residual little metal filings that haven't been caught by the filter, both during the running in process and during the life of the machine. Obviously, you don't want to be putting those back into the sump, so these need to be wiped off. Don't panic when you see this, it's perfectly normal. Just make sure that you clean it thoroughly before replacement. Also, you'll need to put a new aluminium washer on, and when you've done that, replace it into the sump. I think the manual specifies that you should use some sort of sealant. I don't think it's necessary, but I'll leave that up to you. The threads are tight enough already, and my personal opinion is that in the long run it may cause problems with those threads if you keep putting sealant on. The torque setting for this plug is quite high for a sump plug. It's 35 Newton meters. It's usually in the mid-20s for a sump plug, and with a fresh washer I don't think you're going to have any problems with leaking. I certainly didn't. Now you're ready to refill. Now, Royal Enfield say that with an oil and filter replacement, the engine will take 3.1 litres of oil. I don't like pouring it from the bottle. The markings on the side of the bottle are generally only approximate. It's difficult to see how much you are actually dispensing in relation to what's left in the bottle, and it does create the danger of overfilling. So in this case, 3.1 litres. I know for a start I'm perfectly okay putting 2 litres in, so I poured the entire 2 litre jug into the engine. I then dispensed another litre into the jug and carefully poured that in, keeping an eye on the level in the sight glass on the side of the engine, stopping just as it came above the minimum mark. I then started the engine. I let it run for approximately 30 seconds, switched off and waited for 5 minutes. The level didn't come back up to where it had previously been with the previous fill, so I poured the remainder of that litre into the engine, started it up again. Obviously in both cases you need to replace your oil filler cap, and I let the engine run for 5 minutes. I then switched the engine off and waited again for the oil level to come back up. Now, people have different opinions as to where the oil level should be with this sight glass. The manufacturer just states that it should be between the minimum and maximum mark. I personally prefer to have it about 3/4 of the way up between the minimum and maximum mark. And remember, you should only check your oil level when the bike is on a level surface and the engine is warm. Checking the engine cold won't give a true level. Now, I went on to top up this engine a little bit further. I'd already put 3 litres in. Theoretically, according to the manufacturers, it will only take another 100 millilitres, but I actually put about 150 millilitres in just to bring it up to my preferred level on a bike, and the level has stayed constant ever since, although to be honest I've not done a lot of miles. When you've finished, check for leaks, make sure that your filler cap's back on, and take the bike for a run. Now, the biggest revelation for me with this oil change was the gear change. Obviously you remember me saying that the gear change was a little bit glitchy and a little bit clunky, to be fair. This Silkolene Pro 4 has really transformed the gearbox. I initially took the bike for a 10 or 15 mile run. Not one false neutral, no sticky gears. The gearbox was as smooth as silk. As silly as it sounds, it had transformed the bike. Right, so I hope I've covered everything and answered any questions that people might have. I've tried to make this oil change video as thorough as I possibly can. Once again, thanks very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this video and found it useful. If you have, please leave a like and subscribe to this channel. I will of course leave all the relevant links in the video description down below. I will of course be back next week, although I don't have a clue at the moment what I'm doing. So until then, please ride safely, and I'll see you soon.